So now, now I just want to, go ahead with the give an overview of how do we create. And while I'm creating, I'm going to explain what I'm going to do, what are the key aspects of Azure Function. Now, Azure Function is a high-level term, right? It has multiple subcomponents in that. So we'll try to cover that during next 15 minutes to see how to create Azure Function, what is to be taken care, and how it. So if no doubts, right? So we will quickly jump to that demo. Okay. So now, as I said, I will cover this session. Now, next 15 minutes, we will focus on creating an Azure function and write a simple function which is triggered based on a timer, and then it just print out the current date and date timestamp. Okay. So while we're creating this, I will explain few more key terminologies and what to take care while creating it, so that you get an idea of what are the things to take care. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So what I was saying is this. What I've done is I'll go back. So this is the function app, the section where I can create a new function app. So the first thing I have to do is I have select a resource group. So I have an existing resource group which I'm selecting here. You can as well go ahead and create a new one. And I'm going to give the name of my function app. So now the key point here at this point you have to understand is the name of the function app is academy-function. Okay, so that's a function app name, right? This is not your function itself, right? You can have a Azure function app which will have internally multiple functions, each of them having their own triggers and code. Okay, so right now we're just creating a function app which is like your overall container or overall group of all the functions that you're going to create. Okay, so again here it can be a simple code base, or if you are using Dockers and you want to make it containerized, you can say container. Here I'm going to use the code. I'm going to use these are the technologies that you can create Azure function with. Again, I'm going to use .NET here, region that you can select. Now, once you do that, so every function app needs to connect to a storage account. Basically, it will use it for its basic, kind of storage and temporary storage, everything. So here I'm going to allow it to create a new storage account. This is basically for its kind of to take care of its running and details around that. So again, here I'm going to select the operating system, again Linux or Windows. So I'm going to select Windows here, and next comes the plan type. So plan type is consumption, is what I was talking about. Consumption is wherein you are charged based on the consumption of your Azure function. So as I said, you can run it 24, you can keep it active 24 hours, but if you're only getting 10 requests a day, you'll be charged only for those 10 requests. That's a consumption plan, right? So similarly, there is you can, instead of creating a consumption plan, we can as well use a app service plan, which is similar to your app services. When you're creating an app service, you can select size, SKU, and the size, and your cost is depending on the SKU. So if you see here, this is what I was telling other time in the app service is here I'm saying that, okay, you give me a server which is 1.75 GB, which has a 1.75 GB of RAM, right? And I'm saying that I need this server with so-and-so. So this effectively becomes an app service which is focused, which is running your function app, right? So generally, in most cases, running it as a consumption makes sense or would work in most cases because of the designs. The function app is generally used for to process a set of data and send it off to the next. When it's basically trigger based, right? So when something happens in other external systems, it triggers Azure function, it processes and saves it into DB or sends it to the next stage, right? So consumption plan makes sense, and generally Azure functions is developed where you need a simple processing which doesn't take time, and there's a timeout of 10 minutes. So If your Azure function is taking more than 10 minutes to process each request, it will get timed out. So generally, any Azure function should not take a few seconds, a few minutes to process. Okay, so example, it could be you're getting a file dump from some third-party application, and you're getting a CSV file, and you want to process the CSV file and save it onto a DB, right? Now this is where Azure function may come into picture, because you can ask, save this file in this blob storage, and then have a trigger for this Azure function that whenever a new file comes into storage, you go ahead and process that example. So that's a scenario where you can use Azure function with serverless or as a consumption plan, right? So again, I'm going to use consumption here, and then I'm saying networking. So again, networking is your standard where you want to secure your Azure function to ensure all the basic security and network. If you want to run your function inside a virtual network or VNet, VPN, so because any architecture you provide, any design we provide, it has to even include your virtual networks and your networking side to ensure the data is secure and your transactions are secure. So we need to ensure the Azure function is put inside a VNet or VPN, or to ensure that part of it. Monitoring is basically, monitoring is where you can use App Insights to monitor where everything about what happens in the Azure function. You can monitor it using App Insights. Again, I'm resembling it here. It has a cost impact when you use an App Insights. These are tags that for you to identify what is this Azure function. And finally, I'm going to say create. So here it gives you an overview of what is there. And if you know about ARM templates, and if you're creating multiple Azure functions, you can download a template to save it as a template and then execute the same, create multiple Azure functions with different names based on your need, right? So I'm going to say create. And once it is created, we will quickly, go ahead and write, as I said, create. Now what we're creating is this Azure function. So it will not have any functions in it. It's just as I said, a placeholder or a grouping of set of functions that you're going to develop. Azure function as such is just an empty container with nothing in it, right? So once it is created, we are going to create the individual functions based on the need. So you can have one Azure function app, and it can have 10 or 20 functions specifically built for each purpose or each need of your business. Okay, so again, that's where you can group them. You can have multiple Azure functions, each having a set of functionality grouped under each of them. So example, all the incoming CSV files you can process as one Azure function, all the, let's say, Excel files as another Azure function. So it depends on how you want to design and how you want to process them as individual functions, right? So now let's see if it is still creating it here. Yeah, so now it is done. So if I can say go to resource. So as I said, yeah, so here the Azure function is created, and I can do a browse. It just opens up the default page. This my Azure function is up and running. So everything is fine, but I cannot do anything here because it's just a sample landing page, right? So now this is where I have something called functions. So an Azure function app can have multiple functions, right? Now what I've done here is when I'm creating Azure function, I've said I want to use the .NET code. So once I start creating an Azure individual functions, all of them will start using that particular technology as the code. So now when I'm developing the Azure function, there are many ways of developing it. One, I can develop it in the portal itself, which is what I'm going to do now. And then, you could develop in your standard tools, any visuals, any editors, and then you use your source control to save the source code there and deploy it to Azure functions. So that's more a practical or more the general way we use. We generally don't develop in portal. Here we are just for us to learn Azure function, I'm doing it. But generally the source code will be in the source control like Git or Azure Repos or GitHub. And you use your IDEs to develop, multiple developers will work on it. and it gets deployed to the Azure function in the portal. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to develop in the portal, and next comes I have to select the trigger. So there are many triggers here. So as you see here, HTTP trigger is basically an endpoint which anybody can hit the HTTP API like an API, and it gets, the Azure function gets triggered. A timer is it, you can set a schedule, a timer, and it keeps triggering it every time the schedule hits, right? So, and again, there are queue storage. Queue storage is whenever there's a new entry, you can create Azure queues, and then whenever there's a new entry into the queue, it triggers the Azure function, and your Azure function can pick up the items in the queue and start processing it. Similarly, your blobs, your event, and most of the standard services from Azure, you can have a trigger point, including something like RabbitMQ or Signal or various other services. Okay, so again, here I'm going to use that timer based. I'm going to give a name. Okay, so timer demo function. So again, just to let you know, this is the function app name, and Academy-function is the name of the function app, which has a function called timer demo function, right? Both are, this is what is going to have the logic and execute. This is just a container for all the functions, right? And here I'm going to schedule it to use, I'm adding it something like every half an hour is the schedule there. It uses something called, this is the style, this is the syntax. It's a cron expression, every second, minute, and hours. So that's just, I will share a link on this, so you can go ahead and understand how it works. So I'll also go ahead and create. So once this is created, since I've said I'm going to develop it in the portal, I will be able to write the code, test it, and do everything here. So once I have it, now if I go, now it is created, the function app is created. Now I'll say code and test. Right. So now what it has is, yes, so I have the sample initial C# code, which I can start writing and modifying it here. So example, this is a standard set of files that you get in any, even when you develop using outside the portal, you will have a CSX file, which is your function app code, and you'll have the function.js, which will have the basic settings of your, whether it's a name of your function app, function, and what is the type of trigger, what is the schedule, and everything. Okay, these are the settings basically, and you will have run.cx. So here I'm basically, it says there's a simple log which says that this time was triggered, and it just print out the current date and time. So now when I say test and run, right, so I'll say run. So now you can see, I think I've given stars. I think every second it will keep printing the logs. So C# primer function executed. So it keeps, see, if you can see here, this is executed at every second. It is trying to execute, and it is just logging, writing the log here. So now this is the place where you can you will have the logic. So example, right? One other thing we have seen here is something called bindings, right? So bindings are, let's say you have a trigger for a timer in this case, right? If you have a trigger for, let's say, a blob storage, right? So bindings is a way to use, now every Azure function will have a trigger and a binding. Trigger is what is the event when this function should be triggered. Binding is what is the information it has to get from the triggering system. Example, right? So I have let's say I have Azure blob storage, right? And in blob storage, whenever a CSV file comes in, I want it to trigger Azure function, right? So the trigger is whenever a new file is dumped into a storage, I want it to trigger the Azure function. Now, binding will help you. When you have a new file, you should also get to know what was the file name, what was the path, and few additional information so that you can process that particular file. Because let's say in a big system, you'll have thousands of files dumped every second, every minute. So how do you know which file was to process, right? So binding will help you to, you can configure the bindings in Azure function to say that whenever Azure storage is triggered, Azure storage file is dumped and it triggers. You can also pass information like the meta information, like the file name or path or everything, which will tell you, okay, this was the file name which was dumped, and you can use that to process. Without the binding, right, so what would happen is you have Azure function, you have a trigger, right, for Azure blob storage. So when the trigger happens, you will have to go back and connect to the storage to figure out which file was dumped or which file was recently uploaded. So all the logic to figure out what file was dumped, when was it dumped, all this logic is completely avoided by using bindings. So you can say that whenever a file is dumped, pass this XYZ information like file name, file path, everything as part of the binding, which you will get as an input into your Azure function, right? So you will get, here you're getting timer info because it's a timer page. But if you use a blob storage, you will get details of the blob and what file name and any information specific to that event. You will get that information, which you can start using. You know exactly what was triggered, which file was dumped. You start processing from there. So that is the reason we need to use bindings in any given function. And other thing you need to know is the direction. So every Azure function can have bindings which are inbound and outbound. So example, Azure function can take an input from a CSV file. It can generate a JSON file and send it as an output to someone else to process, right? So you can have a binding which are inbound, you can have a binding which are outbound, right? So that is the important thing about any function is you should know the triggers, the bindings, the inbound and outbound bindings, and how to configure the binding information to be processed, or but it again depends on the event and everything, right? So once you have this, once I have done the code and test, I'll be able to, this is my overall, as I said, I have a trigger, I have a timer based trigger, and right now I don't have any input bindings. It's just a timer. So I can say my binding is, as I said, I can say I want to, whenever a timer is triggered, I want to bind it to Azure Blob Storage for this blob account and these details. So what happens is whenever a timer is triggered, it will send this information, what you configure as an input, which can be picked up by your function, process it, and send it as an output, which you can again configure, saying that I want to put my output into a particular blob storage or various other these third-party systems, anywhere you want to send. So basically, I want to take it, let's say generally, one scenario is you want to take it from the service bus and send it to a SendGrid. Service bus is your queue, it's kind of a queue where you can keep sending, and SendGrid is the one which sends you emails, which you can use to send emails. So Azure function can get triggered. You can pick up a value from service bus, process it, create the email content, send it to SendGrid so that email can be sent. So that's one scenario where you can use this bindings. Input binding is your service bus queue to know which topic was updated. Output is your email content, which can be sent to SendGrid so that email can be sent. And Azure function will take care of processing the queue, getting the two fields, CC field, email content, create the content, pass it on to your output. Okay. So finally, monitoring. If you enable the monitoring using App Insights, you'll be able to see the complete live kind of details about what logs, what is happening with Azure functions, errors, exceptions, everything can be seen. And function key is basically security side of it to know who can basically to validate if somebody is triggering, they will have to pass a particular key, or to ensure it is being triggered by a right source. So you can have a function keys created, which you can share it with your the source systems to trigger it using the key, right? So that is more to secure the application or secure the Azure function. Okay, so this is just to summarize, when you're creating an Azure function, okay, first thing is you're going to create a function app. function app can have multiple functions, and each function will have a trigger. It will have a trigger. It will have inbound bindings. It will have outbound bindings, and it will have the logic inside a function, right? So irrespective of the type of trigger or everything, this is a structure that every function app will have. Every function will have in a function app. Okay. Now each function app, each function, and now I'm in a function app now. I'm not in individual function. So here is where you can even take care of the scale out and scale in, right? So enforce scale out limit. So example, right? I'm saying maximum scale up to 200, which effect kind of what it means is if you get 200 requests, you can maximum process 200 requests at a time. If you get 210, 200 will process, 10 will wait for one of these 200 to get out. So I'm just giving an high level example, right? So this is a scale out, and why a scale up is not there, because we're not using an app service plan, we're using a consumption plan. If you use an app service plan, we'll have a scale up wherein you can increase the number of functions also. Example, right now there's one instance of Azure function which can execute 20 requests, 200 requests. But if you have a app service plan and you have a scale up, you can have, when you have 400 requests, you can say spin up one more Azure function, two instances of Azure functions, each processing 200. So you suddenly increase your processing capacity. Again, it has a cost impact, but that is a scale out and scale in option. You can configure that and use app service plan instead of consumption plan if you want to scale up and scale out. Okay, so this is what I wanted to cover, and in this session focused on creating an Azure function and understanding basics and creating Azure functions using portal. As I say, in future sessions we will have other type where we have more into code and hands-on and understand each trigger type, binding type. But this is what I wanted to cover here.